Well, so, admittedly, this isn't really the sort of video that I'm used to making. Uh, Whenever I do periodically put out a video with commentary, it's never what would be considered personal. But in this instance, I think I'm going to buck the trend purely because of two things, actually. I was watching a video from Craig Houston earlier on today in relation to an ex-English cricket player named Graham Thorpe who committed suicide a few weeks ago. And in the video here, Craig goes on to discuss his own personal struggles in the past. Something that he said struck a chord with me purely because I can relate. But on top of that, also today, um, I came across the latest statistics that have been released for suicides in Scotland. So I felt maybe I could add my 2 cents to the discussion since I've been there in the past. What Craig said towards the latter half of his video was that when you're in the pits of despair, so to speak, you think that the world will be better off without you, and you're convinced of that fact. And on top of that, it's only when you come out of the other side of that that you start to understand that despite the fact when you were going through the aforementioned pits of despair, so to speak, at that moment in time, you're convinced that your life is terrible. But it's only when you come out of the other side of that that you realize it wasn't actually that bad. You know, you think at the time when you're going through it that everything is awful, terrible, heinous, and there's just no overcoming the obstacles that you face. And I mean, I think for good reason, many people would call it demons that you fight when you are experiencing that, when you're at that low, when you're at that point in your life, if you ever get to that point in your life, and God forbid you ever do end up there. So yeah, it did strike a chord with me. So I think before I get on to that, I will show you the statistics that have come out recently. So it says here that there were 792 probable suicide deaths in 2023, which is an increase of 30 on the previous year, according to figures published today by the National Records of Scotland, with male suicides increasing by 34 to a grand total of 590, whilst female suicides has decreased by 4 to 202 deaths in the latest year. The rate of male suicides of males was over 3 times as high as the rate for females. The average age of death for suicides has increased overall from 41.9 in the year 2000 to 46.6 in 2023. With Philippa Haxton, head of Vital Event Statistics, going on to say that the rate of suicide mortality has been consistently higher for males, and over the last 30 years, it has been around 3 times as high as the female rate. There were 2.5 times more deaths by suicide in the most deprived areas of Scotland than in the least deprived, with remote small towns having the highest suicide rates for most of the last decade, with the lowest rate being found, in large urban areas. At local level, statistically, the rate was significantly higher than the Scottish average in Dundee City, Highland and East Ayrshire council areas, similar to the previous year. Comparable suicide statistics for the rest of the UK for 2023 are yet to be released. However, based on 2022 data, Scotland had the highest rate of suicide deaths of all countries in the UK at 14.0 deaths per 100,000 people. This was followed by Wales with 12.5 deaths per 100,000 people, Northern Ireland with 12.3 per 100,000, then England with 10.5 deaths per 100,000. Other articles on the topic will showcase headlines such as Dundee having the highest suicide rate in Scotland, official figures show. Suicides in Scotland increased to the highest level since the COVID pandemic. The rate of suicide in males was more than 3 times as high as the rate for females. Highland suicide rate remains significantly higher than the Scottish average, says National Records of Scotland. So I'm not going to get into the reasons, which could be, misconstrued as a blame game and whatnot, but I will say that a few years ago, I was in the very same place that Rick Houston referred to himself as being in many moons ago. Same place that Graham Thorpe was clearly in himself, and many others across the UK as well as Scotland in particular. And I think first and foremost, what has to be said here is that when you are in that position, you don't necessarily realize that you're in that position. Now, don't get it twisted. That's not me suggesting that the onus is then on your peers or people around you to notice the red flags, so to speak, because that's absolutely not the case at all. But if you yourself don't realize that you're in that position, then it is a recipe for disaster, potentially speaking. It's all very well and good for people to turn around and say, oh, you should speak to somebody and whatnot. But if you don't realize that there's a problem or you don't realize that you're in the position where you should be speaking to somebody, then you're not going to. And then again, you run into the problems. Again, it's nice you hear people always providing advice and words of wisdom, etc. Speak to your friends, speak to your family. What happens if you don't have friends? What happens if you don't have family? What happens if you don't even work, for example, and there's no work colleagues, etc., that you can speak to? Everybody's circumstances are completely different from the next person, and that's part of the problem, you know? But for myself, I think from memory, we're going back to 2021 going into 2022, and things were going on in my personal life that, as I said, I'm not going to divulge. But as a consequence of this, I did begin to sort of spiral in terms of binge drinking a lot. Um, I guess I would fit the description of an alcoholic at the time. I was binge drinking heavily to the point where I was actually at one point drinking on my way to work and drinking during my day at work and then drinking the entire way home from work, you know? I had it all planned out. This was going on for weeks and weeks and weeks. I would go to the shop that was nearby the building site that I was working on to go and buy more beer at break. And then I would have a tin, and then I would put a tin up my sleeve and hide the other two tins until lunchtime. And then when lunchtime rolled around, I would drink them and go and buy more and do the same thing again. And I did this for weeks and weeks and weeks until eventually I got caught and I was fired. And as a result of that, I walked straight to a drug dealer's house that I hadn't been to in years. And I started to spend most of my savings that I had accrued over the course of the last year of work on drugs, effectively. And when I say drugs, don't get me wrong, I'm not talking about like heroin or crack, etc. I'm just talking about amphetamine, speed. But it was enough that combined with the drink to just comatose me for days on end. I would just go completely dark. And I did this for weeks and weeks and weeks, going into months. Disappeared off the internet, stopped making videos for a long period of time. I sort of completely vanished, even on Telegram, etc. And then the following year, things got worse and worse and worse to the point where I did get to that fateful day, shall we say, where I had a rake of pharmaceutical pills, medicines, and started to gab them on the shores of Loch Ness. Filled to the ginnels with alcohol, of course, and the drugs that I'd been abusing for months at this point. And I vanished away up into the hills of Loch Ness and I waited for my fate. My plan at the time, as silly as it sounds looking back, was to effectively just pass out and end it all, so to speak. But I got lucky, I guess you could say, as I woke up spewing. I woke up vomiting. And had I been in a position where I choked on my own sick or whatever, then I wouldn't be here today. But because of the position that I'd fallen asleep in at the time, how I'd woken up, I woke up spewing. But it's not exactly the sort of thing that I'm proud of. It's not the sort of thing that I love to talk about, but I think it's sort of important to address, more importantly, some elephants in the very large room, the national room, if you will, Scotland, or even the UK, but in this conversation anyway, Scotland, with the latest statistics coming out and whatnot. When you are that low, it is impossible to see a way out, you know? And for some people, they're lucky, they've got loved ones and they've got friends, etc. And don't get me wrong, I did have friends at the time. I still do have some of these friends, not in real life, but I had friends online. But there's only so much that they can do, you know? Everybody's got their own life to live. Everybody is responsible for their own life, more fundamentally, but you can't expect people to be there for you all the time. There's only so much that people can do for you anyway. But again, not everybody is lucky enough or fortunate enough to have loved ones around or friends around, etc. I'm more specifically speaking about the individual themselves. When you're in that position, you know, you do not realize that you're in that position and you genuinely do become convinced that the world would be a much better place without you. You do become convinced that your life is just a burden. And I think wholeheartedly that I agree with the notion that not just suicide, but mental illnesses and whatnot, they are actually illnesses. I know that there's some people that would dispute these claims, but I absolutely would agree with the notion that they're illnesses because they do take their toll and they do become harder and harder and harder to grasp or grapple, even overcome, you know? So when you're in a rut and you don't see a way out, this brings me back to when I made reference to the onus is on people around you. It's absolutely not. The onus is not on people around you to notice. I guess the onus is on yourself to notice, but that is the hardest thing to sort of grasp, you know? It's the same with anything, with addiction, etc. The first step towards recovery is acknowledging that you've got a problem, but if you can't see that you've got a problem, then how are you going to overcome it? And that's the point. When you reach pits of despair, you don't realize that you're in the pits of despair. Quite often, it takes something drastic to happen in your life for you then to turn around and go, "What the fuck?" My what the fuck moment was the Loch Ness episode. You know, for others, it might be something totally different. But for all the platitudes and the advice and the words of wisdom that you'll often find from people who, they're being sincere and genuine and friendly and whatnot, such as, oh, go and find a hobby, go to the gym, speak to somebody, etc. All of that advice might be applicable to somebody, but it won't be applicable to the next person. So if there's somebody that was listening to you or listening to a video about advice to, overcome suicidal thoughts, etc., if the advice that's being presented isn't applicable to them, then it's kind of done them a disservice. I think that's something that seems to go um, it's something that is overlooked often. It's all very well and good to provide people with advice, but they never seem to acknowledge that the advice that they're presenting people isn't always applicable to everybody, because as I said, everybody is different. Each case is different to the last. Each case is different to the one that's coming after, you know. What happens if you don't have friends? What happens if you don't have loved ones, etc.? Because loneliness is a big problem in terms of suicidality rates. You know, that's something that seems to be completely under discussed, as well as alcohol and drug addictions. Good portion of suicides could be attributed to that. Could be a combination of all things. But as I said, every case is different. The only thing that I can really suggest for anybody out there who feels even remotely negative about life, you know, whether you're in debt, whether you're struggling with loneliness, and believe me, I've been there. Even to this day, I don't really have anybody I would consider a friend in real life. Most of the friends that I've managed to commandeer, for lack of a better term, over the years, I've found online. You know, there's a few people that if I bang into on the street, I'll converse with, but I wouldn't necessarily message them on Facebook or whatever it may be and suggest going for a pint. You know, I don't have that luxury. I don't have siblings. You know, I do have a lot of family, but they're not really in close proximity, and I'm not really close to them either, you know. Whereas other people have large families, etc. And even then, if they've got large families, they don't necessarily feel that they can open up about their issues and whatnot, regardless. So I'm saying everybody's different. What I'm trying to say is whether it's loneliness, financial issues, the state of the fucking world, society, or whether it's relationship issues in terms of you're struggling to find a partner, you know, whatever it may be, everybody's different. So I'm not going to sort of patronize people by saying, oh, go to the gym, bro, or whatever. If that's, you know, that could be an option for some. But what I would suggest is looking into some of the charities that are available. This is probably the most sincere advice that I can give you. I'm not going to patronize people into thinking that going to the gym, getting a dog for some pet therapy, etc., is going to fucking work, you know? No. I would suggest some of the charities that are available across Scotland because these are people that can help you in so many different ways. You know, avenues can be opened up to you, opportunities can be opened up to you in terms of meeting like minded people who have been there, who are going through it, you know? For, I'll give you a wee example before I showcase what I'm talking about in terms of charities and whatnot. After my Loch Ness debacle, I was in on and off contact with some sort of mental health worker. It kind of did fall through, but that was my doing. You know, I uh, I stopped getting in touch. I just wanted to get on with things. But when they asked me what my hobbies were, I didn't really have any hobbies. The only hobby that I would consider that I have and had at the time was hiking. I like to go out hiking sometimes with my dog. So I said to the woman on the phone that that's what I like to do sometimes. And she said that she would be in touch in the next few days after she'd found some uh, hiking groups in and around my vicinity. So something as simple as that. I mean, she did find me these groups. I just never really followed through with it. But point I'm getting at is if there's even if you've got one interest, you know, these people might be able to help you in that regard. Find people and groups in your local area that you might not necessarily have even known existed. That's the best advice that I could give. And to people as well, something else that Craig Houston mentioned in this video, the people who are friends with somebody who has started to open up about their feelings or has made reference to feeling down or they're appearing or coming across as slightly different to how you expect them to be or how they've always been. Don't just brush them off. Don't just disregard their change in demeanor and whatnot. Allow them to speak if they want to, you know? Honestly. Or pick up the phone, see how somebody's doing. Seriously. So you got the likes of Samaritan Scotland, for example, even the NHS website. But again, this isn't applicable to everybody, you know. What else have we got here? We've got suicide prevention, Scottish Action for Mental Health, and I mean, it is a tragedy. Two people die by suicide every day in Scotland. You know, I mean, it's savage. It's horrible, to be honest. If you're up in the Highlands, Mikey's line. This came on the back of several years ago. There was a few suicides in the course of one weekend in Inverness. You know, no matter how big or small the problem, we're here for every evening. For additional text and support service options, keep scrolling. There is people out there. I'm not suggesting that you should go to some sort of doctor or psychologist or a therapist. And quite often, half of the time, these people have never actually experienced what you're experiencing at present. And again, even to get to that point, you have to concede or acknowledge that you've got a problem. But I'm talking about if you just feel down, there is groups out there who will accommodate your feelings. You don't have to feel down. Trust me when I say this that I wish I had followed the advice that I am giving right now back in the day and approached some of these groups. Maybe things for myself wouldn't have got as bad as they did, you know? But going back to my point about therapists and whatnot, quite often you'll go there and you can see them clock watching. They're just basically reiterating what they learned in their their psychology university courses and whatnot. It's really down to people who can empathize with you on a personal level as opposed to some dickhead who's just there because they're getting paid to be there. So that's why I'm not suggesting that you should approach a doctor and whatnot. These are the sort of groups that I would suggest that you should approach if you feel down. And as I said, I'm not contradicting myself here because when you're in the pits of despair, you don't necessarily realize you're in the pits of despair. But the point I'm trying to say to anybody that's listening to this, regardless of your reason, your circumstances, and whatnot, if you feel shit, if you feel alone, if you feel negative or low, etc., there are groups out there that are literally there to accommodate people such as potentially yourself if you feel that way, you know? Another group, men's sheds, connection, conversation, and creation. That's what joining a men's shed is all about. Men's sheds encourage people to come together to make, repair, and repurpose, supporting projects in their local communities, improving well-being and reducing loneliness and combating social isolation. There is groups out there. There is charities out there. You don't have to feel that way.